Okay, so welcome everyone to our Parent Voices discussion on police brutality. This is the second in a series. So for those of you who may be interested, the first series we just did the history, police brutality, and some of the legislation that were passed, and also there was some discussion about its connection with the Bill of Rights and all of that, the amendments. If you are interested in learning about that, we recorded it so we can email that link to you. Although there will be, like, you may cut off the first 15, the last 15, because that's just us talking. So today we're doing part 2 of that discussion. So we encourage everyone, if you have any questions, to write your question in the chat. We also encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat. Just say your name, where you're from, if you have any organization, so we know who's joining us tonight. And I think that's it. Owen and I are co-hosting, so we'll be monitoring your questions in the chat room. So I'll pass it on now to Owen to introduce that. Oh, Parent Voices.
Yes, please.
Anyways, there are some people here who are not part of Parent Voices. So we're a parent-led and run group. This is our 25th year in California, and we're a parent advocacy group. We most of our advocacy statewide is around early care and education, legislation, and the budget process, and the same at the city. We also discuss related and relevant issues that affect our families' lives. So as long as there's a political will to bring on an issue, we cover it, like this one. The parents wanted us to discuss this because it's happening right now. And it's been happening for a long time. And we can see that there's a lot of national like events that kind of make it important for our parent advocates to understand the full context of police brutality and why people of color are victims more so than non people of color. So now I'm gonna give it to Owen.
Thank you, Maria. So I'm Owen Velez. I am I'm a volunteer parent leader with Parent Voices. I'm also a volunteer for the Coalition of Concerned Legal Professionals. And for those of you that aren't aware of either one of these organizations, just to give you an idea of what's going on today, this session is a result of a collaboration between the Bay Area Coalition of Concerned Legal Professionals and Parent Voices of San Francisco, where simply put, Parent Voices is a parent-run advocacy organization, and I may be following up more, repeating what Maria said, but they're a parent-run advocacy organization made up of predominantly of women of color. They care for the babies, their education, health, and well-being, and this includes their safety. These women organize and host educational sessions for their membership, and this Know Your Law session, as I refer to it, is partly to understand better the chess game that is being played and the board that we are all living on. So today we've invited Daniel H. Fisk to speak on the history of police brutality and the use of force by the state on its own citizens historically in the United States. Daniel Fisk is a full-time volunteer organizer with the Coalition of Concerned Legal Professionals, CCLP. He is operations manager of Bay Area CCLP and is on the board of directors of the National Coalition of Concerned Legal Professionals and is the publisher of the national CCLP legal magazine, The Verdict. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Daniel Fisk.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, very happy to be asked. We covered some ground in the first session, but even if you missed that, this stands on its own, and there's been a lot of preparation put into it, so I guarantee that you'll learn something out of it. And the last session, we covered some of the history of police brutality, which is something that's on everybody's mind and discussion, specifically what's happening. But to really attack the problem, one needs to know a little bit about the history of it, what's worked and what hasn't worked in the past. So, and there was a few comments from the last session. One was people wanted to know what to do. So we'll be covering some of that, though there's no instant answers, but we're getting to that. And also, people did not want to just see my face the whole time, even though I dressed appropriately. But so I put together a PowerPoint to be visual and explanatory. So there will be times that I'm just going to put it on a slideshow and that we can do it. So you'll just hear my wonderful voice in the background. And I may or may not be looking at the chats as they're happening. So, but I'll try to go back and forth. But for my preference, I prefer to get out the presentation and then take questions afterwards. But I may go in and out of the format. Okay, so without further ado, okay, so police brutality. In May 2020, at the height of the COVID pandemic, Minneapolis police were caught on video murdering a black man whom they had arrested on suspicion of passing a $20 counterfeit bill. And the police officer held his knee on George Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes, and as the other officers with him stood by, even as George Floyd pleaded, respectfully saying, "Please," many times, "I can't breathe." The officer continued to kneel on his neck even after he lost consciousness, and Floyd died soon thereafter. This is something that we know. And the murder was eerily reminiscent of the murder of Eric Garner by police, placing him in a chokehold on Staten Island in 2014. And in both cases, the victims pleaded over and over again that they could not breathe. And the murder brought to the forefront all the other police-inspired murders of Black people and low-income workers in our country, where the police have basically assumed for themselves the role of judge, jury, and executioner. So as we've always said, it's a crime to be poor. Now it's a capital crime to be poor. Since Floyd's death, thousands of people have been protesting in at least 1,700 cities across the country, with similar protests happening across the globe. As it says there, 15 to 26 million people in at least participated in at least 1,700 cities. Police have used tear gas, rubber truncheons, rubber bullets, truncheons, armor-clad police as they confront protesters. Governors of some states have activated the National Guard to aid the police. And as we know, President Trump has brought in the military to Portland and has threatened to bring it into other places. Floyd's death came on the heels of the shooting of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, two other high-profile incidents in which Black people were killed, and follows a long line of history of police violence against Black people. Now, we want to go into a little bit of, this is not new. This is not a new situation. It is new in the fact of this is a buildup of a kind of outrage, but we want to go back, I want to go back to Rodney King and what happened in 1992 and 1991 with the Rodney King protests. As an example of the approach used to sideline dissent and compare it to situations where the confrontation, where the conflict translates into fundamental change in the system of governance. Some of the people listening may not have even been alive then, but a Californian with a video camera happened to witness and film an event March 3rd, 1991, that is a daily occurrence in cities across the country: the savage beating of a black man by 4 white police officers. The 4 white police officers badly beat Rodney King. He was a motorist. They stopped on suspicion of DUI, and his beating was caught on video and it went viral. The chronicler gave the film to local TV. They in turn pass it on to the major networks, and a mass audience gets to witness the very brutal fact of organized violence by the police against those who inhabit our poor communities. The ensuing outcry from the public leads to LA forcing its police chief, Daryl Gates, to resign and its prosecutors to criminally charge the police officers involved, at least the ones who could be seen in the video. So in a move that strains the credulity of the majority, a state appellate court orders a change of venue to from the ethnic mix of LA, an area where I'm from, to a nearly all-white suburb in Simi Valley. So there's no socioeconomic peers of Rodney King. One could say it is not a jury of one's peers. All America watches the beating over and over and over. This time, okay, this is 1992. This time, critics say they won't get away with it. They were wrong. To the stunned amazement of the majority of Americans, many of whom watched the trial on television, the jury returns verdicts of not guilty. And a New York Times poll and a CBS poll taken between May 6th and May 8th indicated that 76% of whites and 95% of blacks agreed that the verdict was unjust. None of the politicians, though, are willing to demand a change in the written LAPD rules in which the verdict was made to rest. In other words, the LAPD, not unlike most police departments, have certain rules and training for when they can use deadly force or violent force. So they weren't willing to upset the status quo. That was the, so that stood. The decades of discrimination and economic deprivation and victimization explode into LA. It spreads to San Francisco and all across the country. So as it says on this current slide, officials in LA declare an unofficial martial law. Literally, there was a curfew. They didn't come out and say we're declaring martial law, but that's what it was. 58 people were shot by the police, many in the back. 3,000 people were injured. 2 of them had to be seriously hospitalized, and they arrested 17,000 people in LA County alone. Most of the people arrested were first time that they've been arrested. Why were they out there? Because they were pissed off. Everybody knew the message. If you could beat someone like this senselessly for no reason at all, and then nothing would happen to them, even though the trial was in the public eye and was the story of the day, then this would happen to, and would continue to happen to every black, brown, and poor person in the country, or could. Everybody knew that message. Protests and disturbances, again, we're talking about the history to go to what are the lessons and apply to the situation today. Protests and disturbances continued for 4 days and nights as the president mobilized over 10,000 National Guard troops, as well as 4,500 Special Strike Force members fresh from the continuing occupation of Panama. Now, why did they bring in troops from Panama? I'll tell you, because a lot of the young men who were members of the National Guard were from the ghettos or from the barrios. They didn't want to be shooting down their friends, relatives, neighbors, people that they identified with. So from the military standpoint, they were, quote, unreliable. So they brought in extremely reliable troops to occupy the streets of Los Angeles. General Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, gives his opinion, says, yes, we need to bring in Army detachments to conquer the rebellious South and Central LA residents. Damage estimates are $1 billion. The president promised a federal investigation on the one hand. This is George H.W. Bush, and he called in the Marines and the Southern Command on the other. These were the same people who in Panama reduced parts of Panama to rubble. The police chief was replaced by Willie Williams, who is a Black public relations expert who was fresh from Philadelphia, where he pacified a population after they had dropped bombs in 1985 on a counterculture group called MOVE. They dropped bombs from the air. And so he helped sort of mollify people at that time. So they brought this guy in. He was Black. He was the right color for being in front of, to try to cool things down. So in LA, we know, because we had an ad hoc coalition of concerned legal professionals. That's the organization I work with and no one works with and other work with. 85% of the 17,000 people have never been arrested before. So just think for a second, if your jails are already overflowing, they're at 75, 85% capacity, and you just happen over 4 days' time to arrest 17,000, what do you do with people? Well, they already had 23,000 people of 25,000 of the jails, so it was full. So they began putting people in warehouses. They began putting people on buses and driving them around the city. They installed a chemical toilet at the rear of each bus. People were kept there for 5 days. If someone disappeared in Los Angeles and family members suspected they were arrested, they could not find them through traditional booking. They were gone. So, and every low-income person in LA now most certainly had friends or relatives in jail. And the complaints about even harsher treatment in the community after the riots became prevalent because the police were now really on the attack. Many people that had a breadwinner, a person who was a mechanic, they were a maintenance worker, they were a restaurant worker, they did any other kind of job. Hey, they were out protesting. Now there's loss of income. So there's something called the Constitution. The California Senate was concerned that the Constitution of the United States required arraignment within a matter of days after arrest. So you're arrested, you're supposed to be brought as an arraignment within 48 hours to deal with the fact that you're there. They set bail, they set the next court appearance. Sometimes there's a plea, guilty, whatever. There's assignment, they deal with counsel. Different things happen. You're not supposed to be able to just be disappeared, but that's what was happening. So they passed a law permitting authorities to hold those charged with crimes arising out of these riots for a period of 7 business days. Okay? Whereas 10 days is often a sentence for violations of misdemeanors after a finding of guilt. So if you have, let's say, some infraction or violation or misdemeanor, and let's say you're charged and everything happens, and then the judge sentences you, he might sentence you to 10 days. Well, here, people are already in 7 days. They haven't been charged or convicted of anything. So now the enactment, so this is the California legislature deciding, oh my God, we're going to violate the Constitution. We better do something to cover our butt. So we're going to say that it's okay to hold those accused of crimes for these riots for a period of 7 days. Now, what it says on the screen is there is some legal terms, not defining them all, but you can take some notes, do the follow-up. This is stuff we need to understand because this stuff is happening now too. The enactment was passed after the fact of arrest. It was aimed at a specific grouping. That makes it what's called a bill of attainder, an act of a legislature, I'm reading from something, a definition from Black's Law Dictionary, an act of a legislature declaring a person or a group of persons guilty of some crime and punishing them, often without a trial. So in other words, you decide a specific group of people a particular law applies to, not everybody else. So they said, we're going to apply a law to these, quote, rioters. And it was also called ex post facto law. It was law that retroactively makes criminal conduct that was not criminal when performed or increases the punishment for crimes already committed, both, prescribed by the Constitution. Martial law existed de facto, as did the suspension of a writ of habeas corpus. That is, it's a legal document that says, I'm not a lawyer, but I know this from working with lawyers. I present a document called the writ of habeas corpus. It's one of the oldest writs in common law. It says, means produce the body so that you can't just disappear people. You have to be able to bring them to a court so the court can say, okay, should this person even be here at all? And the presumption of innocence was rendered a nullity because these people were already presumed guilty. Okay, so that was happening out of LA. They set bail at $5,000 and in some cases $50,000. And as we know, for a poor person, if you get a bail of 500 or 200 or 100, it could be the same as $1 million. So no one has any bail money. Without counsel, without access to medical care or the medicines they needed, without community of any kind, such conditions are, and I know you're already thinking about this already, can probably finish my sentence, conducive to extracting a guilty plea, right? Because you're under oppressive conditions. If you can't make your apartment rent, or you can't go to work, you might lose your job, or you might lose your apartment. So you say, well, I don't have access to my medicines and no one's letting me make calls and everything. So I'll just plead guilty to whatever they say and I'll try to deal with it afterwards. So what was the lesson? The lesson was no justice exists. So while the situation unfolded, we're talking about 1992, the whole country was up in arms around this. No hope was offered to the nation. Our so-called leaders had nothing to say that spoke to the situation. No candidate of either side of the now existent political fence had anything to say. Presidential candidate Bill Clinton said more police should have been mobilized. President H.W. Bush said they would convene a federal grand jury, at the same time bring in the Southern Command. The protesters were adamant, we're not, enough's enough. We're not going to live this way. We're not going to be treated this way. We don't just care about ourselves, we care about others. We're indignant, the same kind of indignation and determination we see now. Hazel Dukes of the NAACP was reduced to tears at being called by the protesters Aunt Thomasina, as she and other Black leaders, so-called Black leaders, called for federal indictments of the 4 officers as the sole recourse to the oppression and exploitation behind the verdicts in Simi Valley. And obviously people weren't too, think that was too swell because they just went through a whole trial and nothing happened. And they weren't too interested in scapegoating a few individual officers. They were interested in how did this happen? And how do we make sure it doesn't happen again? But there was, that wasn't what was happening. So the massive protests that followed the shooting used as their slogan, "No justice, no peace." Across the country, communities erupted. Much of the activity was never presented in the media, was never presented. So a false picture was presented. They try to portray people as rioters rather than as protesters. And, you know, as I'm saying that, you're probably thinking, well, they're doing a lot of that now too. Exactly. The president had begun by saying, all right, the decision is over. Now let's get back to business of running the government. But he had to run for cover as first LA and then cities across the nation broke down, and people, under the terminology today, felt disrespected by the decision, and felt isolated from the political process, to the point that the riots that took place across the US was at a level not seen since the anti-war days of the first Civil War in America, which was a Civil War of 1860 to 65. There was something called the New York City draft riots. This was, the Rodney King protests were the largest riots that took place up to that point. So, interesting footnote, what are the New York City draft riots? For those that don't know, the New York City draft riots, July 13th to 16th, 1863, were violent disturbances in Lower Manhattan, widely regarded as the culmination of white working class discontent with the new laws passed by Congress that year to draft men to fight in the ongoing Civil War. And the rioters were overwhelmingly working class men who feared Black people competing for work and resented the wealthier men who they could pay. There's a rule, they could pay $300 to a poor person, that which was equivalent to maybe $7,000 in today's money, or maybe more, what's called a commutation fee to a substitute. Someone else would go fight for them. Well, these guys knew that people were dying on the battlefields, so it wasn't actually like you could take that money and really plan out your future. You would be killed. But there was also a lot of racism involved in it too, and scapegoating and blaming Black people. So it was turned into just like a free-for-all. Anyway, President Abraham Lincoln diverted several regiments of militia and volunteer troops after the Battle of Gettysburg to stomp out the draft riots. The rioters were not even viable to any of the organization. Getting back to Rodney King, we're just closing that out to get the lessons from this. The traditional, Black leadership, such as the NAACP and the Republicans and the Democrats, as entities, I'm not talking about the individuals, but as an organization, they went along with it. They tried to do some of the tried and true tactics to control things rather than solve things. So I mentioned that they replaced the chief of police with this gentleman named Willie Williams. So they got a Black police chief in, which was sort of following the same pattern of Richard Nixon after Watergate. They said, okay, let's get Richard Nixon and we'll get rid of the scandal, replace him with Gerald Ford. It was the appearance of change through changing of personnel. The rioters themselves were made scapegoats. The verdict was wrong, but, say the liberals, they said, oh, but you shouldn't be rioting. You might be angry, but you need to. They didn't have anything to say. They labeled the rioters hooligans to take away from the actual reality of the situation. We have that happening now. Again, there's corollaries. Why are we going through this? This is not academic. This is not just a bath in the facts. This is not something from a college classroom. This is presented by organizers to other organizers who have constituencies who want the truth so they can organize through the truth. The National Guard claimed the driver they shot in the back of the head was trying to run them down. Okay, and the media replicated that. Well, that's BS. How can someone who is saying they're trying to run you down get shot in the back of the head? So the government could not just stand there in silence. Everything was done, including they set up Rodney King to speak to the American public. Mr. King was not called to the stand during the trial. Why? Because he was not very articulate. He felt very uncomfortable. A lot of people that aren't trained public speakers or feel uncomfortable in those kind of settings shouldn't be asked to be put in that position. But he was asked to get up there and speak, and by the prosecutors, and he made some statements, that everyone should get along. But that was all sort of using him to try to cool down people's anger. And the media was no real ally for the truth. The media was manipulated and the facts were manipulated. In fact, the New York City mayor at the time called on the media and he said, please don't publicize the disturbances in New York. He said, if people don't know about it, maybe it will simmer down, maybe it will go away. And then congratulated him later for helping keeping it cool. So even the facts of Rodney King were manipulated. Okay, so I wrote that on here. There were 3 people in Rodney King's car. Did you know that? They didn't mention Freddie Helms. They didn't mention Brian Allen. They were beaten, they were dragged out of the car and they were beaten too. They don't talk about them because they were trying to minimize the severity of it. They were trying to contain it. You minimize it if you say there's only 1 person beaten. You minimize it if you say there was only 4 officers who were doing the beating. There were actually 17 officers around at that time period who were just as much a part of the complicit in it. And if you're really looking at it systemically, you'd say there's a whole police department that trains, has policies, that briefs to do what they did. But if you just contain it to these 4 bad officers or try to give that impression, it's false, it's misleading, and it also leads you down the wrong path toward the enormity of the problem and what the solutions are. One of these, I forget which one, Freddie Helms or Brian Allen, died in a car accident under mysterious circumstances that were never investigated. The other sued the police and the district attorney to press charges against the officers who beat him, but the DA refused because it was not in the public spotlight. As I said, it was hidden that there were more than 4 officers on the scene because the focus was to scapegoat him. And again, we're talking about what are the lessons to be learned from this? How did the other side really try to contain this, not deal with the problem, hope it goes away? And we're left with today, George Floyd and all the other people who were killed, many not on camera, many on camera. Okay. Why weren't those 17 officers charged? They were complicit. They were sitting around, they didn't stop them. You don't have to go to law school to know that. Why wasn't the system charged that trained the officers, that set the rules, that institutionalized brutality? They did say at one point there was a court that a judge ruled that the LAPD was a corrupt organization by RICO. It was an actual corrupt organization. The LAPD was mad about that, but it didn't change anything. Instead, the media focused on scapegoating 4 officers. So, an information we gleaned, as I said, I'm an organizer. I have been for over 40 years. I'm a full-time organizer. Information we gleaned through organizations we work with all over the country indicated that the extent of the riots or the series of acts of violence and demonstrations that occurred after Rodney King was never reflected in the press, was much, much bigger. There was much more, discontent, not just people who, if you were to poll them, said they were against what happened in the verdict, but were very much out there putting themselves on the line and being as vocal as they knew how to be. So no one really has any idea the true scope of events that transpired following the acquittals of the police officers, just as we have no conception of how many wars the US is really engaged in all over the world. Though we do know that they drop a plane load of bombs somewhere every 8 minutes. We don't know exactly where. Okay, August 9th, 2014, a Missouri police officer shot and killed an unarmed 18-year-old named Michael Brown. The police left his body lying in the middle of the street for 4 hours. 94% of Ferguson police officers were white. Michael Brown was one of the 63% of Ferguson residents who were Black. The official unemployment rate in Ferguson was 27% at the time, and the poverty rate was well over the national average. And as we know, you could have statistics like that and they don't really adequately reflect the reality, because they only count people who are going into the unemployment office, not the discouraged workers or people who can't go in there anymore. As we've always said, it's a crime to be poor. The police in Ferguson mobilized immediately against the protesters, with the media in tow, calling these actions riots. This was followed by the characterization that they were looters. Okay, think back to what we were talking about Rodney King, where they try to demonize you, or what they're doing now, where they try to demonize you as looters or hooligans or lawless, and not as protesters with legitimate the concerns to not get murdered. and then the governor of Missouri mobilized the Missouri Highway Patrol, which is the state police, led by an African-American, Captain Ronald S. Johnson. However, Captain Johnson marched with the protesters, and he supported the peaceful protests. So the governor said, not counting on him, so they sent in the National Guard. Soon the raging cry was "hands up, don't shoot" could be heard across the country, not just in Ferguson. This cry reflected the demand to be heard from a population with no alternatives to continued degradation, declining hopes and aspirations, and who saw no options for change within the same system that kept them poor and oppressed. So it was not simply, as we know, people getting mad about Michael Brown. It's a buildup that they were mad about Michael Brown and other Michael Browns. And the police responded with tanks and other military-grade weapons. Police forces are increasingly opting for arsenals of assault rifles, concussion grenades, and as I put on the screen, what's called MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush protected vehicles. This is military hardware. That's on the street. The day of the beat cop is over. It's military. And they become ubiquitous to the US military presence in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the federal government turned these weapons over to the local police forces. That was done under the 1033 program that was named for a section of the National Defense Authorization Act, which provided congressional approval of upwards of $4.3 billion, in military equipment to flow to police forces throughout the country. And the program quickly gained popularity among police chiefs for the high firepower and low costs. So some people are now calling for defunding of the police. well, see how that matches with this. Some police forces in communities like Watertown, Connecticut, have purchased MRAPs. They're usually priced at $700,000 each. They get them for as little as $2,800. So even if you cut the police budget, doesn't mean they're not going to be buying this kind of weaponry because it's been made available to them. Interesting, huh? These various protests are culminations of contradictions that have been fulminating in our poor communities in the United States for centuries. So we have to ask, first the discontent is met with police batons, then tear gas and guns, and then it's met with what? Promises. And then it's met with what? Distractions. When the tear gas clears and the fires stop burning, what will our poor communities be left with? And what will be left with the promises once they're broken again? So just on an article here, July 30th, speaking of Michael Brown, new prosecutors launched a review of the case and they decided they're not going to bring charges against the officer. Why do they do that now? Because they drag it out for 6 years, so they hope people will forget about it. So that people, if you say Michael Brown, they'll say, Michael Brown who? You know, and then, or what case was that? I don't remember, you know, so many of them. But they will not have the same poignancy because it's a distraction. If you push people off and you set the time out that way. You can get it. So they want to use delay tactics as a way to hope will dissipate the anger. I used to work fixing little electronic gadgets, and there was a thing that was a clip called the heat sink, and you'd clip it onto a piece of the component as you're soldering, and that would draw the heat off of it so that you wouldn't zap out your whole, you know, circuit board. That draws the heat. These tactics they use draw the heat away so that they can keep going and the status quo remains the same. Again, we're going to be getting to solutions. Don't be depressed. Don't hang your head down. Don't cry. We're getting to that. We're trying to lay out some of the groundwork, so please bear with me. Okay. As part of the usual moves to close out opposition to police conduct in Ferguson, the U.S. Department of Justice did an investigation. Their resulting report called on Ferguson to overhaul its criminal justice system, declaring that the city had engaged in so many constitutional violations that they could be corrected only by abandoning the entire approach to policing, retraining its employees, and establishing new oversight. The report described a city that used its police and courts as money-making ventures, where they would nickel and dime the population with fines and fees. Remember that coming out at the time, people say, you know, I'm just driving down the street and I get stopped 3 times and I get 3 tickets. And each ticket is X amount of money. And that was going into the coffers of the city. They were using it as money-making. So that was also part of the pervasive harassment atmosphere. Because, you know, getting a nice $150 ticket, well, damn, I don't have milk for the kids. A place where officers stopped and handcuffed people without probable cause, hurled racial slurs, used stun guns without provocation, and treated anyone as suspicious merely for questioning police tactics. Shortly after the report was issued, Thomas Jackson, the embattled police chief, stepped down, and city prosecutor Bob McCullough lost his re-election bid after failing to indict the officer who killed Michael Brown. Okay, the question I ask, the question we all ask here is, did that change anything? Those 2 people in powerful positions left, did it change anything? However, the New York Times, in a recent article, reported that black drivers in St. Louis County, which is the county Ferguson is in, continues to be stopped at a much higher rate than white drivers, despite a new law capping the percentage of revenue that municipalities are allowed to earn from the courts. There's a disparity in traffic stops of black drivers in Ferguson has increased, and I'm just reading from here, by 5 percentage points since 2013. It increased since 2013, census time period, while it dropped by 11 percentage point for white drivers. The executive director of Arch City Defenders, a legal advocacy organization that has fought these ticketing practices in St. Louis, spoke to the status quo to be one of structural racism, poverty, overinvestment in a system that locks people up, and policing and prosecution. He said, and that's what he does, he said it is real today as it was in 2014. Excuse me. Changing of personnel is an old-time tactic to give the appearance that things are changing because the bad apple has been removed. Yet, unless there is an address to the systemic nature of the problem, changing the face of the problem will not change anything. Okay, let's look at one case of this. A perfect example of the approach to calm down the population is to set up commissions or investigations into the cause. And I'm telling you, and this isn't really a bold prediction, it's just a prediction, that there will be calls for commissions and investigations and fact-finding committees and so forth around George Floyd. So if that's the first time you thought about it or heard about it, you can say you heard it here, but this is what happens. So a highly visible one was the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission, after its chair, Governor Otto Kerner, Jr. of Illinois. President Lyndon Johnson established this 11-member presidential commission to investigate the causes of the 1967 riots and to provide recommendations for the future. The report was released in 1968 after 7 months of investigation. It's quite available if you're interested. Many Americans blame the riots on outside agitators or young Black men who represented the largest and most visible group of rioters. However, in March 1968, after they did 8 months of investigation, they came out with their report. The Kerner Commission turned those assumptions upside down. They said that white racism, not Black anger, turned the key that unlocked urban American turmoil. They said bad policing practices, a flawed justice system, unscrupulous consumer credit practices, poor and inadequate housing, high unemployment, voter suppression, and other culturally embedded forms of racial discrimination all converged to propel violent upheaval on the streets of African-American neighborhoods in American cities. And as Black unrest arose, inadequately trained police officers and National Guards troops entered affected neighborhoods and often made the situation worse. White society, the presidentially appointed panel reported, and white doesn't necessarily have to be a skin color, it could be your attitudes. So there's people who have different skin color who think white. We're using it, obviously, we think more that there's more economic divisions, but for purposes of illustration, we're using it that way, and we're quoting from this report where they say, white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. The nation, the Kerner Commission warned, was so divided that the United States was poised to fracture into 2 radically unequal societies, one Black, one white. These are photos from the 1967. The Kerner Commission proposed aggressive government spending to provide equal opportunities to African Americans, and won praise from African American leaders and white liberals. Even so, the President of the United States was not a fan, and I'll tell you why. Here's the Kerner Commission. There's Lyndon Baines Johnson, President Lyndon Baines Johnson in the middle, not looking very happy. It is rare for a president to offer no public endorsement of a report produced by his own handpicked commission. That is what LBJ did. The president had chosen moderate commission members because he believed they would support his programs, seek evidence of outside agitation, and avoid assigning guilt to the white upper class in control of the country. The report blindsided him. He suggested that communist agitation fired up the riots, and to his dismay, the report disagreed, asserting that the riots were not caused by, I'm quoting, nor were they consequences of any organized plan or conspiracy. And the commission rejected another common allegation that they charge that irresponsible journalists inflame ghetto neighborhoods. So these were things that he wanted to be said, but they weren't said. Here's a copy of the one version of it, the cover that's printed. So the report not only deep six, shredded, killed that idea, but the Nixon administration proceeded to, get this, are you sitting down? Okay, set up a sting operation to ensnare Governor Kerner, who was head of the commission. He was prosecuted and sent to prison, where he died of cancer. Yes, believe it, truth. So the standard response, that was part of the report. The standard responses of police review commissions is to recommend hirings, firings, appointment of federal mediators, new regulations, sensitivity training, videotaping of police activities, and grand jury, civil and criminal, etc. But none of these methods have resolved what appears to be an increased militarization of our community. Many with direct knowledge of life in our urban centers see this as a reaction to quell discontent that continues to rise as economic conditions worsen in our poor and middle-income communities. And it is just getting worse as the pandemic of 2020 increases the Great Divide. Over the past 50 years, many commissions have been impaneled, and I mentioned this some in the first session. Many commissions have been paneled to investigate the untoward actions of the police. It wasn't only this Kerner Commission. That was just one example. As I said, I'm using it as a case study. But you had the Knapp Commission of 1972 in New York City, as described, as they made it like the cavalry coming in at the end of the movie Serpico with Al Pacino, because he uncovered corruption in the New York City Police Department. And they said, now we have a commission. That was the Knapp Commission. But 20 years later, they had the Mullen Commission in New York City because they said there's the same amount, if not more, corruption. And then they had the Colts and the Christer commissions in Los Angeles after the Rodney King. But our communities continue to experience no positive changes in these conditions. Okay, so it's important that we know what are the tricks, what are the traps, what are the minefields, what are the quicksands that are out there so that we don't go into those again. Okay, now I'm gonna throw you a little curveball, so bear with me, take a deep breath. The Rodney King protests and the government reaction had the potential to change the country, just as the protests sparked by a long series of videotaped police murders of Black men in 2020 do. There have been times like this before in American history. This is akin to Concord and Lexington. Okay, this is where I'm saying, bear with me a little bit. Don't think I've gone off the deep end. I'm here. I don't have a fever. I have one of these things here. I check myself. See, I don't have a fever. I'm sane. Okay, you can touch yourself too. I'll do it later. Okay, but the battles of Lexington, what did the Concord and Lexington signify? This is the American Revolution. The battles of Lexington and Concord were the first military engagements of the American Revolutionary War. They were brought to that point through a whole series of events. They were fought on April 19, 1775 in Middlesex County, province of Massachusetts Bay, within the towns of Lexington, Concord, and the surrounding areas. They marked the outbreak of armed conflict between Great Britain and the 13 colonies in America. Okay, what was the beef? The colonial government, that is Britain, exercised control over the colony outside of the British-controlled Boston. They were controlling the colonies. In response to fighting back about this, the British government in February 1775 declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. About 700 British Army regulars in Boston, bear with me, were given secret orders to capture and destroy colonial military supplies reportedly stored by the Massachusetts militia at Concord. The militia were regular folk who wanted to protect their land and their country. Patriot leaders had received word weeks before the expedition that their supplies might be at risk. They had heard about it through their intelligence gathering, and they moved them to other locations. The first shots were fired as the sun was rising at Lexington. At the North Bridge in Concord, approximately 400 militiamen engaged 100 regulars from 3 companies of the King's troops, resulting in casualties on both sides. So there was an armed conflict. The outnumbered regulars fell back from the bridge and rejoined the main body of British forces in Concord. The British forces began a return march back to Boston under heavy fire in a tactical withdrawal, and eventually reached the safety of Charleston. The accumulated colonial militias then blockaded the narrow land accesses to Charleston and Boston, starting the siege of Boston. Okay. Take a deep breath. I went through some history. I know we sometimes have trouble with history, unless we see that history, we can learn from it, and it's poignant and relevant to our current lives. Then it's not just history. It's bigger than that. So these battles, this was a major battle because the British were known as the biggest, baddest, toughest armies in the world. They had an empire. The saying was, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because they had bases and troops all over the world. They were the empire. So the fact that these little militias took them on and gave them a bloody nose was a big deal. But who cares? How did it grow into something? Those battles were a result of a group of businessmen in the colonies who played both sides of the fence for 100 years leading up to the American Revolution. They had really been the freest men in the world. Playing both sides mean that, hey, man, the king's giving us some goods here. We were able to do some smuggling here, or we can sell some liquor here, we're getting by. It wasn't that they all said from the day one, hey, we need to change this. It didn't happen that way. Those who were ultra left wing in the businessmen's grouping had been rewriting their demands for years. They would have meetings. Men were more educated in the day. They had something called the American Philosophical Society. They had meetings all over the country. People go to the lectures and get inspired. They built something called a Committee of Correspondence to publicize what the British were doing, what oppression was going on, so people would know. It started out with letter writing campaigns that went the length of the colony. Some of the letters began to go to people in other colonies than Massachusetts. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, they put out pamphlets and they printed them. These things were cherished. They were like the most valuable thing you had if you got one of these pamphlets. You'd read it over and over. It was dog-eared. You'd pass it on to your friend. They would pass it on to other people. They talk about the persecution. They talk about the oppression. Did you hear what they did in Britain and with how they, in Concord and Lexington, they beat the butt of the British? No, get out of here. They did? Yeah. It built awareness, it built unity. You mean the British, there was a lot of British tyranny going on. The British could go into someone's house and take it over. You know, they could rape, they went in, raped your wife and daughter. They would take whatever they wanted. This was happening all the time, just that people couldn't do anything about it. So they write some of this stuff, pass it on. Some of these were published in newspapers. Some 1,500 people maybe read the newspapers, maybe 220, went up and down. Sometimes an article was held up at a meeting. Hey, look what I found, and they'd pass it around. That's how the word spread. At a quorum at a meeting in Boston, they elected someone named Sam Adams. He founded something called the Sons of Liberty. These were men of action. They were agitators. They were, some people called them rabble rousers. Here's a saying by Sam Adams on the screen. They were saying, our survival's at stake. Are we going to continue to be treated this way? Will you stand by and let it happen? Which side are you on? Not everybody was thinking that way. There was a lot of people who were like, well, there's a lot of, you know, I don't like the way they're treated, but what are you going to do? And at least I'm getting by, and I got me, you know, some goods I smuggle, and I'm able to get, you know, do this and that. And there are others who said, no, a small number of people, no. Are we going to be allowed to be treated this way? Are we going to let it happen? And they would go around and they would talk this up in bars, and or they go to the docks and they get a group of people, maybe give them some drinks, get them all when they needed a group of people. Sam Adams also was dealing with the money. He said, do people really believe the British would continue to sell tea cheap once they knocked out the other markets? No, they would, it would have an effect on the entire market. You know, if they were trying to grow tea and have them and sell the tea in the new colonies, and the British would come over and sell the tea low, you know, it's just like if you have a cell phone plan. And then the new company comes along, Verizon, and says, we're giving you a great deal. It's only, you know, 50 cents a month now. And then they take over another company, and they take over another company, and then their monopoly, then the price happens to go up to $20 a month. Well, they own the whole thing, so they can set the rules. Same thing. So he was saying, being prophetic, you think they're going to keep the tea low, price low? Where do you think this is going? Think, people, think. So the entire commerce of the colonies was to be destroyed and made dependent on British monopoly. This is a very short course to the American Revolution. The situation in Concord and Lexington came down after 25 years of letter writing and fist fighting. And representatives of the merchants and the businessmen found those in solidarity with some of the poorest people, and they collectivized all these to go against the crown, to go against the king. The actions in Concord and Lexington did not mean anything by itself. What combined, again, I'm trying to make a point, we're not doing a history class here. What combined was to make the difference was the fact that there was a Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. Our runner came in with the word, what had happened in Lexington and Concord. Hey, did you hear? They gave a bloody nose to the British, our guys up there, you know, folks like us. Really? No kidding. Yeah. They've been driven back to Boston. No. You sure you have reliable information? Yes. And George Washington was sitting there. He had some bucks. He was a plantation millionaire. And he stood up and said, I volunteer that I will pay the training and enlistment of 1,000 troops. And I propose to move immediately upon Boston to free that city from the land and from the hand of oppression. So all of those things bubbling up got the backing of someone who had some bucks that could put the things at a whole new level. In Concord, in Lexington, prior to the incidents that sparked the 1775 to 1781 American War of Independence, there was a group of committee people from all walks of life who were organizing a positive program with a positive goal in mind, who could organize and agitate and speak to people. They didn't just say things are bad, and they certainly didn't say, at least they'd say nothing can be done. These were the can-do people, and they were a very small number of people, but they got others. So, police brutality is a means of control. It is not the entire problem. We have a system of government that has suppressed the wages of Blacks and other low-income workers, relieved them of property through fines, fees, redlining. I'm working in Bayview, Hunters Point area, and there's a lot of people who are getting their property taken apart because they want to gentrify this area through illegal means. Slum clearance, more recently predatory lending, excluded Black people from equal schools and masked the fact that the powers that be have excluded the entire working class from such schools, while the wealthy placed their kids in private schools, leaned on the government to defund education, and left working class families fighting for the scraps. I don't have to tell you, you're right in that fight. Police departments and local courts engage in their own form of looting by handing out and collecting excessive fines and fees from vulnerable communities. A 2017 report, we're in the home stretch now, by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights found that municipalities that rely heavily on revenue from fines and fees have a higher than average percentage of African American and Latino populations. And cities rely on tax revenues not only to fund the police, but also to pay the ballooning costs to settle police misconduct cases. Here's an interesting case. Here's an interesting fact. Chicago shelled out more than $100 million to settle police misconduct suits in 2018 alone. Chicago shelled out $100 million to settle police misconduct suits in 2018 alone. Cities and counties sometimes have to issue bonds to pay out these settlements. Banks collect fees for their services and investors earn interest. So some of the beneficiaries of that are the big banks on Wall Street. But what is needed is leadership, real leadership for our community. Do you notice that when a young man is gunned down or strangled by the police, the mother or the grandmother becomes the spokesperson for some period of time for change for all mothers who have lost their sons? They didn't ask to be put in that position. They're in an extremely vulnerable position because they're grieving, but they're thrust into that position. The negative lesson of that is that these spokespeople are many times under the influence of the misleaders, the local chill out squads. Not all the time, not all generalizations are wrong, but the federal government comes out on the scene, puts a lot of pressure to be able to make statements to cool things down. Not dealing with the problem. Again, we've talked about this through Ferguson, Rodney King, now George Floyd. They come out on the scene a few days or a month to let everyone scream and protest, to get it out of their system or put in government funding and programs, but not to address the systemic problems that led to the tragic death. Or the Rodney Kings, who were given a microphone. He didn't ask to be, he didn't feel comfortable. He had been beaten, not just senseless, but he needed medical attention. That was his first priority, to get himself well, but he's being pushed out into that limelight to say, can't we all get along? No, we can't. We can't all get along. Not when we have a government spending more and more money on drones and bombs and prisons and less on education, food and healthcare and courts. No, we can't all get along. The positive lesson from the person propelled on the national scene is that someone who never was a leader, never was a spokesperson, never was an organizer, maybe never spoke in public, is forced into that role. So you may have someone who starts to become a leader or an organizer through that. But it's at a time when the police have taken the most important thing in their life, such as a child taken from a parent. So that's where we come in. We have built organization here. We have walked the streets of our communities, teaching by action. We've been fighting for legal recourse, building leadership from all walks of life, to build a force for control over the legal system, knowing it won't change without changing the system as a whole. We don't have to wait for another young man to be gunned down the streets or for any litany of outrages to be perpetrated against our low-income and working communities that actually make it into the media. These things happen every day, usually behind the scenes. As I mentioned last time in our first presentation, one of our contacts since passed was the pioneer in the area of police misconduct litigation, Hugh Manes, M-A-N-E-S. He won the largest awards against the police at a time that those cases weren't being done, and he trained a whole generation of people to do those. He had a case of a wedding shower of Samoans, and the LA Sheriff's Department came in and started beating people up, and he won like $25 million. But he later said, you know, I did it to not to get attorney's fees. I did it to change things. But my theory of winning large enough awards didn't work because they just simply budgeted for it. So that's why he was working with us, and others do. So whether it's a young man killed by the police, or someone denied medical care in a life or death situation, or someone forced to work in an unsafe surroundings by a company that does not protect them from COVID exposure, with the state, federal, and occupational agencies, health and safety agencies that are responsible turning a blind eye, or someone unfairly fired from a job or coerced into pleading guilty into a crime that they had no part in, and they were sent to prison for decades. This happens every day in our city and county and country, in this country. So in our call to action, there's things that we say no to, so that we need to know what the things that they're going to be coming down the pike with or have, and we need to say, no, we're not going to take the next Band-Aid. Sorry, we're ready for that. We don't want the cool-out tactic. We don't want the replacement of personnel. We don't want the symbolic action of painting something on a street by itself as presenting that's the answer. We don't need just armbands. So, so your efforts in those communities is important. Say no to co-optation, say no to whatever cool-out tactic that will ultimately make no difference. We have to organize the people. We have to raise the money to do it. We need to build the committees to meet on it. We need to produce newsletters to tell the truth about it. We need to get that passed hand to hand, because we can't rely on an unreliable media. It's hard work. We need to lead out the tactics to find out more and more and spread the word. We need to get out to the students who are looking for doing something with their life and not just going to school and being in debt and not being able to get a job. That's a whole scam right there. We need to tell them the story and get them into the fight that can save us all from slavery as a nation at this time. So join in this fight. Okay, thank you for listening to me. I hope that was okay. And I think if there's anybody that has any questions. Okay, here's a question. Question, is there a danger in privatizing the police? Okay, I have a question. Okay, we talked about that a little bit, about privatizing the police, and I believe Mia had talked about that in relation to a very good example in Camden, where they, do you want to talk about that, Owen, or do you want me to just summarize what I remember?
I mean, I could, because so much of my family and friends are from that area, including myself. Um, you know, there was, just to give you a quick summary, like since Camden, New Jersey is actually the birthplace of the record industry. The first records were printed there, and the record industry and the music industry was huge up through the early 70s in Camden, New Jersey. And after the riots, the 70s, that were, I guess they began with the riots in Watts. Camden, the fires that were set in Camden, the damage that was done in Camden, the white community just abandoned and just left it. So they're like, hey, if you guys want to burn your city, then we'll just leave it like that, all the way through the crack era, all the way through the 90s. Some of those same damages you could see when I was growing up there. You could still see the lamp black from the fires from 20 years earlier. So in New Jersey, they sent funding all over the state to urban areas that had issues and had economic issues and crime issues, and they sent money all over the state. Jersey City got a lot of money. They gentrified nearly their entire city with it. Newark did the same thing under Booker. Don't be fooled by that dude. And then Camden, two mayors went out of office in handcuffs for stealing the money. So over time, it became like a case file, for corrupt cities, governments, and drugs and crime issues, murders, things like that. And so they eventually just gave up on the police force and had the county take control of Camden, and then they hired a private police force, essentially a police force that was unlike anything in any other city. And the way that they did it was how a lot of these private organizations in the 20th century do. They put a lot of money into tech. And so now Camden, New Jersey has become a huge surveillance police state. They have high quality cameras, multiple points on every corner, all the way through the city. And they're constantly investing in algorithms to scan for, human identities and scan for things. And it's like the city is constantly under watch. The members of the citizens are constantly under watch. And then the same folks that control the streets also control the process for reporting police brutality and complaints against the police force. And so a lot of that stuff has been swept under the rug. And now the national stage is looking at those reductions, those false reductions in crimes and violent crimes in Camden. And they're trying to use the Camden police force as a blueprint to privatize police forces across the country. And I will tell you that is not the picture that they're selling to the country is not the reality on the ground. And I can tell you that. And anybody who wants to spring for the plane ticket, I will take you there and show you myself. So that's about all I can offer right now, if that helps, Dan.
And I think it's good to know that, because we are looking for solutions, and that's why it's very important to see what that really means to defund police, or how do you improve this situation. So there's a question here from Elia. And then before I give that to Dan to answer, I just want to share that in San Francisco, there's actually a strong movement, the CJCJ group, and the youth advocates who fought to close 850 Bryant. And there's a savings about 123 million from closing that, and also not filling in vacant positions in the police department. And so this money is being freed up. And we submitted our proposal to the Human Rights Commission to help fund Black communities, especially in early care and education, get kids ready for kindergarten, all that stuff. But anyway, so I just wanted to share that, and I want to go back to Elia's question.
It says, Elliot says, I have a question about Oscar Grant. So what is the question about Oscar?
I think Oscar Grant was shot by the BART police.
Right.
And Vanessa is the one. There seems to be a lot of killings lately in Fort Bragg. They discovered another body of a young soldier. And so it's scary how the very same people, the law enforcement, the military, who are supposed to protect the people, are the ones harming the people, and even its own young members.
Okay. What is the question about Oscar Grant?
Yeah, is anything happening for the Vanessa Gillen? She was in the military and they found her dead. She was raped and killed.
I don't know. I've been following that, and it was a very sad thing when they found her.
Yes.
And so someone else may be more up to date on that case.
Elia, I think they're also doing an investigation on it.
Yeah. Okay.
Other cases, yeah. But that's, I think,
Okay.
a whole nother problem with the system. Any other questions?
And also the killing that happened here, remember?
In Vallejo?
Yes.
Yeah, so they're also investigating that.
Yeah, and some people say that they destroyed all the evidence from the police.
What was
So
the
they said that they destroyed the evidence from the police. So I don't know what's going on with that.
Monterosa, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some connection also with that kid to Parent Voices, because the fiance is one of our Parent Voice kids, but so it hits close to home. Not everybody knows Desi, but like our last batch of Parent Voices. We have 4 minutes more.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Sure, Roger.
So, you know, I sort of look at things psychologically sometimes, even though we're talking about social issues. And I'm always curious, at the end of the day, these politicians that look at us and talk to us with such a, you know, genuine kind of attitude, you know, who's sincere and who's not? You know, I'm just always trying to make that assessment. I mean, how deeply does these kind of scripted shams of commissions, you know, how deeply does it go? When they were writing Black Lives Matter in the streets of New York, and de Blasio was out there, I mean, is he just, you know, hustling everybody, or does he think he's doing something? I'm always, and there's a million different mayors and cases we could address the question to, but I just wondering if you can comment on that a little bit.
Well, I think I might have used this example before, but you had a Black man who was president, who was very well spoken, very articulate, and we have who we have now, and we have other people that sort of remind me of on the cover of Mad Magazine, and then somewhere in between. So they have all spoken differently, and they have different mannerisms, but the policies haven't all been that different. You know, President Obama would receive a list on a clipboard. It was either a Tuesday or a Thursday, and he would sign off. It was a kill list, and who would be assassinated through a drone strike. That was someone who was well-spoken and people had a lot of hope for. But also it is systemic. There's a book called Obama's Wars by the noted journalist Bob Woodward. And it accounts in there actual transactions that occurred in the White House when Obama got elected, which you could substitute for any president when they're newly elected. And they meet with the defense establishment, the CIA, the Defense Department, the National Security, and whatever other designations. And they said, it was not, the tenor of the meeting was not congratulations on winning, we're at your service, as you're our commander in chief, we're here for our orders to carry them out. The tenor of it was, yeah, you're president, but you know, not so much. We have some secret things going in all around the world, some operations. You know what? We can't even tell you about them. And you better not mess with them, those plans, because there's a lot of people are making a lot of money out of them. And if you do mess with it, we know you've made certain statements about it in public, just like John F. Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy had said, I'm going to rip the CIA into a million little pieces. And he did make some moves and certain things happened to him. That they, you know, so there was, you got a sense from that, even if, you know, for me, it was underscoring what I already knew from other reading and studying and knowledge and life experiences, which was, there really was a deep state that was just beholden to very, very powerful interests. And that the president, for all practical purposes, was going to be a figurehead. Now, they might go into, he might have gone into it really wanting to rock the boat. I can't really say, but all I know is the reality is that there is a lot of pressures, even on the younger congressmen and congresswomen to go along. It's very difficult to be in that position. There's a lot at stake. So I don't know. I'm going to throw it back to you a little bit. What's your gut feeling about some of those people? Do you really think that they have the best interests of the people at heart? A lot of them, I think, are sort of there and make statements to cool things out. And if they actually strike a chord, they're going to get messed with. Now, when De Blasio came in, he said, "I'm going to stop." I think they'd ruled out stop and frisk before, but but they still were doing it. Basically, they called it something else. I'm going to stop the profiling. The police basically went on strike, so they didn't call it that. But he was at a press conference. They all turned their back to him. I think they put some black insignia over their badges. They made statements that were definitively a threat that he should watch out what happens to him. And then he changed his story. One could say because he didn't have a backbone, but maybe he just wanted to live. So we have to sort of visualize, because we're not there, those kind of pressures, but we also have to understand what kind of government we're in. And the thing that was said earlier about the woman who was killed in the military, you know, we're a very violent country. It was started by slavery and going after indigenous people, and it has 800 military bases in how many countries, and there's that culture, and it doesn't just, even though they're charged to protect things and protect and serve, whose interests are they protecting? You know, I was doing a training class here to some of our volunteers about labor history, and that's something that we could do at some point, which is very interesting because you live in a city of extreme labor history, the 1934 general strike and other kind of things. But one of the things you're talking about was they had, after World War, there was people that went down to Central America, and there were wars in Nicaragua. Many times it was invaded. They set up the Panama Canal and so forth. Anyway, one of the military leaders was a man named General Smedley Butler. Look him up. Very interesting character because he was a hard-charging military guy. And then he later on said, 1933, I believe, he says, I was just a tool for Wall Street. I was a bully boy. I was a gangster for Wall Street. I was there to do their dirty business. It was not about protecting, you know, the glorious ideals of dot, 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 dot. So I think we need to look at these things soberly, not negatively or cynically. Anyway, those are a couple comments.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna call on three more people, and we're past time. But if people want to leave, they can. If people want to stay, they can. So Vanessa has a comment and a question, and then next Lourdes, and then Naima. Vanessa, are you still on?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay.
I have a question. First, I'm a native of San Francisco, so I just want to know, like this evening, there were like over 12 Zoom calls about the same issues. That's what's going on either in San Francisco or with the Black Lives Matter and all that. I just want to know, how is your agency collaborating with so many other groups within either I don't know where you're from, like the LA area, or, you know, in San Francisco, because there's so many different things going on, and it seems like the collaboration is not coming together. It just seems like people are like hosting meetings, but then nothing's really getting done. Just like if they paved the street, okay, what does that mean? If they're giving money to different areas of San Francisco, is it really reaching them? I mean, they say it's going to go for mental health. It's going to go for education and things. And a lot of times nonprofits, they're starting to just pop up in these areas. And even now, they're starting to pop up in these areas saying, oh, we're doing this for these people.
Right.
It's that's a disconnect.
Yeah, we call the organization I work with is all volunteer and non-government funded, so it's completely volunteer. We historically have seen groups pop up, and we call them sort of poverty pimps, people that make their living off of poverty. But one of the things that we do is, our mission is dealing with the justice system. And since 1989, we've been fighting 7 days a week to build a justice system that works for everyone, not just a few. And that's our mission. And we've organized attorneys, law students, paralegals, legal administrators, court reporters, court translators, professors, with businesses and with people in the community. We have an office in the Bayview of Hunters Point. I came here in October because the operations manager had a serious illness and she passed away in November. So I came in to help keep things going. But we sponsor free of charge, know your law and legal advice sessions. And so we have free legal sessions where we have attorneys. We urgently need advocates. We have many cases. People are fighting eviction, people dealing with all sorts of problems. August 5th, we're going to be having a webinar if anyone wants an invite on background checks and identity theft. We have 2 attorneys presenting it. And we do, and it's sort of a little difficult, as we know, with during this times of the pandemic, to get out to people and so forth. But we work with as many organizations we can. We work a lot with labor unions, churches, clubs, to go at. Dwayne Gaines is in office now. He says he is a shout out to you, Vanessa. So but we'd be happy to get referrals to meet with people. Most recently, we were invited and attended the Unions for Black Lives Matter held in front of City Hall. So, and so I'm not aware of all of the coordination things, but we certainly like to help in any way that we can.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. So can we call in Lourdes next? Then I think the question.
Yes, I'm ready. First of all, I want to thank you, Dan, for your presentation. It's very powerful. It's always good to learn about the history of the struggle, and many deaths. Oh my goodness, so many lynchings, other things, like the law doesn't really work for us, the people of color. And I think that's something that we have to keep working on. And second of all, I wanted to say something about empowering ourselves and some things that I like your message at the end, you know, united with us, let's keep fighting. And some powerful things. We received an award from Coleman Advocates. And in that award, Maria invited us, and I had the pleasure to hear the testimony of Gwen Woods. Gwen Woods, she's a really strong woman. She's truly fighting for it. And for the other question, when we see the true in our leaders who are truly leading us, and I think the mothers of the victims of police brutality are key people that are leading us in this struggle. I have to say that Gwen Avery is a bastion in our fight because she's been testifying, and there's no more pain than the pain of like losing your child. I mean, I have two kids. We are a parent group, and then this is when we really be touched. And also, I have to acknowledge the work of the Refugio Nieto. And also, thank you for mentioning Vanessa Guillen, the one that just recently killed in the army, which is also another of our battles. It's something that it's endless, and thank God we're learning, and we're like working on this struggle together between the African American, and I don't like to say African American because we also Latinos, within the Latinos we have African descendant Latinos, and also we're mixed up, and we're not afraid to mix. We're going to continue to mix with other racial, and we acknowledge that power. And the Nieto, Refugio Nieto, and was also truly testifying for her son Alex Nieto, who's been dead by the police with 59 shots because he was having a burrito in his jacket. And he just turned around, and then he did it. They asked him to stop, but he never realized it was about him. They thought they had like a gun instead of a burrito, but he was just keeping his burrito inside his jacket, and he got 59 shots. So I just wanted to say this because we are in the struggle, and this is so empowering to know that it's not just happening now. It happened in the South, it happened in the East, it's happening in the West, and it's continually happening. George Floyd also was only another trigger, and we have to continue this fight. But I also would like to know, are you inviting the mothers to testify and be part of the organization that you're part of? Thank you.
We'd be happy to invite the mothers. I know, and I worked back east for a while, and we would show a film, the 2012 film by Sarah Burns and Ken Burns called the Central Park Five. And we work with some of the mothers who have kids who were kids of the Central Park Five. But we know some, and we need to know others. So if there's people you think that we should know or should know us, or ways that they need help or want to help, we'd be happy to be in touch with them. Our phone number is 415-614-0978. I prefer to if you just call me and we could work out a time to do.
Say that again, Dan.
415-614-0978.
That's your San Francisco office.
Yeah. Is that backwards? Are you seeing it backwards?
You can see it.
Okay.
And also, I want to add that a CCLP also do legal assistance.
Yes.
Mostly on Saturdays, right? Saturday morning.
We have a schedule now of about 22 of them they're putting together. The next one is going to be August 5th at 7 p.m. on a Know Your Law session on background checks and identity theft. It's a presentation. And then the next legal session, I'm looking at our calendar on our wall, is August 15th. But we really need people who can be advocates and help with some of the follow-up on the cases. We could show you how to do that. I'm sure a lot of people already do those kind of things or have those skills.
Are these workshops available online? Oneida, I think, asked how can we sign up for the
The
workshop?
one on August 5th is available online. I can send you the flyer for that right after this. And you can get it out to people. We'd like people to attend that. The other ones are private individual consultations, so they're private. So those are not online, and we're doing them remotely. And though we have sort of started a little opening up. So as I said, we got our gun for temperature, so we're ready. Got got disinfectant. We got masks, different colors, so we're ready. We don't do social distancing, we do physical distancing. They're trying to separate us socially. So one of our volunteers pointed out that's the wrong terminology. So yeah, we need to do that too. So, but yes, I hope that this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And if there's people that you would like CCLP to be introduced to meet with, I'd be happy to, very happy. Vanessa, the organizations that you'd like us to meet with, I'd like to know who those are. Be happy to, meet with them in person or over the phone, to get to know people. There are definitely ways that we can work together. We're very inclusive. We want to work with many people. Lords, also, if there's people that we should meet with or know, the mothers or others, please let me know. We're very happy to do that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dan. I know we were supposed to have you until 7:30. It's already 7:46, and
Can you put your email in the chat?
I have his email. I can
Yes,
share his
okay.
email. Yeah.
Can you answer my question very quick, or he needs to go?
Naima too. I forgot Naima. Naima has a question. Let me go back. Where was that? Naima. Where's Naima's question now? Naima, can you?
Yes.
Oh, there's.
Okay. Are you ready? Yeah, I'm ready. Yes. So thank you so much, Dan, for the presentation. It's really helpful to know all the details about police brutality. So I have like a really broad question, and hopefully I'm gonna find an answer from you. So I'm kind of wondering if like today's protesters will eventually make a change and stop the police brutality, and do you think this is like protesting against what's going on is an effective way to make a change and stop the racial injustice in America? I know it's been really, the protesters have been like doing all kind of things to to express their anger, but I'm not sure, how do you think about like this kind of their way of expressing they expressing themselves against what's going on?
That was part of the lessons of today's class. Gee, I sound like a teacher. Part of the lesson was which is a good thing, but was to talk about, as a case study, let's look at Rodney King when in 1992, where there were protests all over the country. And people were protesting, went on. And then there was all sorts of other activities around it. Did that change anything? And the answer would be not in the way that all of us here at this table would like change to occur. There was a series of cool out, chill out, various things to minimize, to deflect, to distract from it so that it went away out of the mind's eye. And they're going to try to do that again now. So if you're at a police line, that is the people that run the status quo, that is one of their strong points, the police. So trying to convert the police is, and particularly with the police have escalated into militarization. So you're basically talking about the military that you're right up against. The way, part of the lesson of Concord and Lexington was it wasn't just a battle that happened in one place, but it was broadened out to other strata in the community, in the country. It broadened out. It developed determination. It recruited people who made commitments of lifetime commitments, who said, I'm stopping what I'm doing so we can get this done. And they would put in the time to make it happen. And they developed training. So you had a group of people who became trained leadership and could bring in more people, and would also be able to give the alert and sound the alarm when one of these tricks and traps would come down the pike and said, don't do that. They're trying to fool you. They're trying to distract you. So I think the short answer is no, it's not going to change anything by itself. The long answer is yes, it can change it by it if all those people, or a percentage of those people, start to pick up the lessons from the past and get involved in building the kind of apparatus that is sincere, has the people's interest at heart, are not the poverty pimps, or not the government fund, but are the people that are going to do that. And we offer training programs in that regard and work with organizations around the country that are offering training programs in that regard. But I'd like to, anybody who wants to, that is a very good question, and I feel I've given it short shrift, so call me up. I'd like to finish that conversation, or anyone else would like to finish that conversation, because that's really the point of the session. Thank you.
And we do have one more session with Dan. So we have to decide when we're gonna do that.
One more scheduled session.
One more schedule, yeah. So save some of your questions. Maybe our next session would be more like of a conversation, a discussion. And then we will try to invite the other organizations, hopefully, who are working around this issue in San Francisco. We'll try. What do you guys think? But I want lengthen this 7:51 now, and I know that the parents have to put their kids to bed or prepare dinner. So we're gonna cut end this now, and just know that we will have one more session, and we will post it on our Facebook page and email those who joined us tonight, and invite friends. And so thank you, Owen, for inviting Dan and co-hosting with me. And thanks, Dan, for being here with us, and all our guests who joined us tonight.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Unless someone has a really burning question, we're gonna close the meeting now. Anybody else has a burning question that just cannot wait another few weeks? No, we're done? Okay. So thank you very much, Dan. Owen, do you have any closing comment or?
No, I just want to, I posted in the chat that you can find CCLP on Google. They are in the Bayview. 1237 Shafter, right?
1237 Shafter Avenue, San Francisco.
That's right. Okay. Yeah. So, and they're embedded in their community, and I can tell you, like, they have a good relationship with their neighbors, and you walk through those streets and ask about CCLP, and they've been there for a long time, and they vouch for their community. So for me, when I first started volunteering for them, I walked in those doors and I saw what they meant to the people who lived there, and that's why I stuck around. So, and the same thing with Parent Voices. Since I've been in San Francisco, it's been Parent Voices, CCLP, and the men's mentoring movement, M3, which is supports you know, the formerly incarcerated as they return home. So those three organizations, you know, they're beautiful in San Francisco, and I'll vouch for them to the end.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll say good night, everyone, and we'll see Dan again. Hopefully, we'll see many of you again, or all of you again, and your friends for the next session. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna leave.